Hey, I'm Steve Welliver, and back with lesson 2 in our deprogramming series, where we're going to expose the BIPOC acronym and its creation by the Bolsheviks a century earlier. The BIPOC acronym, standing for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, seemingly appeared out of nowhere. Its origins are a little bit fuzzy, but it did started showing up in publications around the 100th anniversary of the 1917 October Revolution, but by 2020, its use had increased exponentially so that media, academics, K-12 school systems, and government bureaucracies were using the acronym regularly. The BIPOC acronym served to divide the population of the USA into two: the white ethno-racial majority group in one category and all other minorities falling under the BIPOC umbrella, alleged oppressor and oppressed categories respectively. Furthermore, a pecking order of minority racial groups is ordered in sequence by the BIPOC acronym itself. Now we're going to dig right into how the structure and function of this acronym is a go straight from the Bolshevik past. When Stalin addressed the 10th Party Congress in 1921, he started throwing out some population statistics, and it showed that the ratio of ethnic majority to minorities was 52% Great Russian to 48% non-Russian minorities. And that composition isn't too far off from present-day USA, where the 2020 census showed that the non-Hispanic white percentage of the United States was 58% to 42% minorities. 1920s Bolshevik policies divided the population into two: the oppressor Great Russians and the oppressed roughly 190 non-Russian minority groups. These non-Russians were given two classifications: backwards and indigenous peoples. Now we'll get into some details and look at some examples of how the Russian words that translated into backwards and indigenous peoples of communism, of course, correspond with the BIPOC acronym used in America today. All non-Russian minorities in the early Soviet Union were classified as indigenous, and indigenousness, that rhetoric of abuse, entitled these identity groups to special treatment in education, employment, and government positions. The decolonizing project of indigenization would transform minority groups into socialist versions of themselves, making them believe that Soviet power and communism was their own native cultural conception and desire. Now, the word indigenous people, Koronnoi Narod in Russian, was never really used to describe Native American tribes in the United States until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then you can see in the 90s, it gradually started to take off. And in the last decade, really took off like a rocket in terms of exponential growth in use of the term. And while Native American tribes are often the focus of this Bolshevik rhetoric of abuse of indigenousness in recent years, I'm going to quote from Castro Gill, who is very influential in Washington State's education policy. And she says in an interview, quote, "I know a lot of people kind of ruffle their feathers, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where there is a large degree of indigenous influence from indigenous Pacific Northwest people. But indigeneity is a concept that applies to everybody." And that quote was preceded by framing it in the context of, quote, race and power and privilege in the United States and colonialism. So you really see the concept applying to all minorities as the early Soviet implementation did. Now let's move up to the letter B in the BIPOC acronym. Many Soviet minorities also carried an additional label of backwardness. Their relative cultural and economic backwardness was assumed to be as a result of Great Russian chauvinism, the equivalent of white supremacy. Backwardness allowed them to make additional resource demands for development due to, in Stalin's words, national oppression and colonial slavery. Stalin's explanation of backwardness allows you to see why that letter B for backwards was used as a placeholder for B in BIPOC, or for the black population. At the 12th Party Congress in 1923, Stalin declared, "Hence, the second immediate task of our party lies in the struggle to abolish the actual inequality of the nationalities, the struggle to raise the cultural and economic level of the backward peoples." This resulted in a race to the bottom where minorities each claimed to be more backwards and oppressed than the others. But that's why the B comes first in the acronym. In the 2020s, the Washington State K-12 bureaucracy began using both the Bolshevik rhetorics of abuse of indigenousness and cultural backwardness as ways to open up their meetings. The rhetoric of abuse of indigenousness was often lengthy land acknowledgments, and the rhetoric of abuse of backwardness or cultural backwardness was represented by a quote-unquote cultural moment of silence. So let's wrap this up. My takeaway message from this deprogramming lesson is that from backwards and indigenous peoples of communism, from the 1920s USSR to black indigenous people of color, essentially later in 2020s America, the strategy of using an oppression hierarchy of racial minorities for socialist transformation has been recycled.